pathology, the reason I say European pathology is determining the root cause of a condition, right? And we want to get into the mental condition of Europeans at the time that race was invented and used. And we don't understand that race was invented primarily by scientists like Johann Blumenberg in the late 1700s in order to categorize human beings into three distinct groups. You have what was called the Caucasoid, the Mongoloid, and the Negroid, being most of us in this room. Right? And the reason that the concept of race was invented and introduced to the general populace of the world was because Europeans came out of a situation in a climate where there was fierce competition for resources, and in the interest of their own survival and prosperity over other groups, they realized that they had to commit certain acts which would be deemed immoral or which would be questionable in the eyes of other people. So from there, what we have is the invention of race, and we have the propagation of race as a means to distinguish between human groups, right? And when we have the Negro codes, I can go into a little bit more detail, just time constraints right now, but the Negro codes dealt with the creation of the black race here in the United States, and the purpose of the Negro codes was the legal inferiorization of indigenous American and African people. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Now, distinguishing race from racial identity as is relevant to the research, racial identity is defined as the significance or qualitative meaning that individuals assign to being black. In other words, in the mind of a person, what does it mean to be black? What does it mean to be black? How should black people act? How should black people look? How should black people sound? All of these things, any question that you can think of in relation to being black and what it means to be black is going to be categorized and measured in racial identity. There are certain prominent points that we'll discover later on. Next slide. All right. Now, in regards to racial identity research, there are two approaches, right? The mainstream approach to racial identity research is based on finding out how an individual regards race as a part of their identity in contrast with other aspects of the identity. And the research always looked at how an individual placed race how an individual placed race in comparison with other aspects of the identity versus the underground approach, which says the meaning that black people assign to being black in and of itself is enough to merit its own research. Next slide, please, Dr. Muhammad. The two perspectives of sociologists on the impact of racial identity on black education. Now, in regards to the same research, the research on measuring the black identity, determining the black identity and its impact on education, there were two perspectives generated. Some sociologists felt like an awareness of social barriers related to education will cause African Americans to devalue education because they were expected to fare poorly in academic pursuits. As to the other group, the group that identified education and group identification as a source of motivation, says that African Americans have such a rich history of struggling to obtain education, struggling to obtain legal and social rights and privileges, that knowing that history will motivate them to overcome those barriers. Next slide, please, back behind. Common premises underlie both perspectives. Now, with those two perspectives, even though they disagree, through the research, we found some very critical points that both of them can attest to. One of them was that both of them was founded on the premise that African Americans are a devalued group in American society. Premise number one. Premise number two was that African American youth experience and understand social barriers similarly. The premise number 3, both of them offered an optimal state. One of them, high group identification, was thought to be the best or optimal identification for African American people, and the other group saw that low identification, in other words, low awareness, low connectedness with being an African American and everything that entails was looked at as being a low optimal state, was looked at as being an optimal state or a best state in order to ensure the success of African Americans in their academic pursuits. Next slide, please.
Come in. Get off your phone, yes. Okay, you want to take notes.
Alright. So now, if we're going to look at racial identity and its impact on education, being scientists, we first have to look at how racial identity is measured. Alright? And we're looking at how racial identity is measured. There have been several models that have been generated, but the 2 models that we're going to deal with today are the multidimensional model of racial identity and the multidimensional inventory of racial identity. Now, the multidimensional model of racial identity was created with the intent to measure racial identity on 4 different levels. And we're going to talk about those 4 dimensions later, but it's racial salience, racial centrality, racial regard, and racial ideology. And some of those also have subscales that we'll get into in a few minutes here. But also we're going to talk about the multidimensional inventory of racial identity. Now, the multidimensional inventory of racial identity is more of like a survey that was created on a Likert scale. If you've ever taken a survey before and you've seen disagree, strongly disagrees, neither or, agree, that's called a Likert scale. A 7-point Likert scale, they took and put certain quotes in. I'm proud to be black. Being black means a lot to me. I think that the world views black people in a positive light. These types of statements were put into the inventory, and you had a chance to go in and state whether you agreed or disagreed with the statements, and those were the multidimensional model, the multidimensional inventory of racial identity. Next slide, please, Dr. Muhammad. Okay, so now we're going to look a little bit deeper into the dimensions or the areas of measurement of the multidimensional model of racial development. Number 1 is racial salience. Racial salience is the extent to which one's race is a relevant part of the self-concept at a particular moment or situation. Can anybody define for me what the self-concept is?
How do you know?
How you view yourself. Good. So now, if racial salience is the way that we view ourselves at a particular moment or situation, or how relevant race is to how we view ourselves at a particular moment or situation, that means that it's not a concrete thing. It changes from situation to situation. So racial salience is measured more so at the event of a situation or at the moment that something is taking place rather than like a concrete measurement. Now, racial centrality is said to be a concrete measurement because that is just determining, it is self-reported, but racial centrality is the degree to which you use race or ascribe race as a part of your self-definition. So in other words, when you look at yourself, how important is being black to you? What does being black mean to you? In regards to your behaviors, in regards to your thoughts, in regards to your speech, how does being black play a part? What is it to you? Racial regard is a person's effective and evaluative judgment of his or her race in terms of positive, negative valence. Now, in terms of racial regard, there are 2 subscales of racial regard that we have to consider also. One of them is called private regard, and the other one is public regard. So as to where regard is how you feel about your race, or how you feel about race in general, your public regard says, how do you think other people feel about you? In other words, when you look at people of other races and other ethnicities in your daily going about, how is it that you think these people view you as black people? Like, do you go in the store and say, oh, the cashier is looking at me funny. She thinks because I'm black, I'm going to steal something. Or you go in the classroom and you dealing with a teacher and they feel like because you're black that you're not expected to perform at a certain level. So that's the public regard, is how you think other people view you as being black. Also, there's the private regard, which means how do you feel about being black? How do you feel about black people? Like, because we have some black people who look at other black people and be like, man, I ain't got time for them niggas over there. Like, that's how we look at it. So, you know, that's something that was measured, the public and private regard. Now, race ideology, this was a very important measurement, and I think it's one of the biggest ones on the scale because it has 4 subscales. But racial ideology is, how do you think black people supposed to act? How do you think we're supposed to act? I know when I was growing up and, you know, I talked a certain way and conducted myself a certain way, people be like, yo, he acting white. What does it mean to act white? And why is it that behaviors that you see in me, you would associate with being white instead of associating with being black? But how do you think black people should act? And there are 4 subscales to that, right? As far as racial ideology, there's a nationalistic ideology, which we'll cover later. There's a humanist ideology. There's an oppressed minority ideology. And there is, let's see this. Nationalistic, oppressed minority, oppressed minorities, nationalistic, humanist, and I can't remember the other one right off the top of my head, but we'll get to it in just a second. Okay, so that was it, assimilationist. Alright, so this is a schematic model of the multidimensional model of racial identity. At the top here we have racial identity, and we have the 4 dimensions or areas of measurement that are measured as a part of determining one's level of racial identity. Right? And we see, as I discussed before, on the area of racial regard, we have public and private subsectors. We also have the subsectors of racial ideology. Assimilationist was the one that I left out before. Y'all pardon me on that. I'm not perfect, but I try.
You alright? Alright.
Next slide, please, Dr. Muhammad. Okay, so this is a very important one right here, right? How does racial identity influence behavior? And what we found that there was a process, right? Racial centrality, which is what? Anybody remember what racial centrality is? Racial centrality is how deeply you identify with being black, right? So racial centrality and situational cues. In other words, what's going on at the exact moment, along with your racial centrality, feeds into your racial salience. Now remember, we talked about racial salience as becoming relevant at the level of the event or at the moment that something is taking place. Anything that we encounter, the first thing that we do is observe it and we make a judgment in our own minds, right? So this is where racial salience becomes prominent, right? The racial salience adjusts. It feeds how we evaluate a situation based on our racial ideology and racial regard. In other words, like, okay, if I'm in a store right now, and I know that I'm a moral, upstanding black man, and the store clerk is looking at me sideways because she feel like I'm about to slip a candy bar or something in my pocket, and they walking around, following me around the store and stuff like that, and I observe this, and I say, hey, well, this is where racial regard comes into play. You know why? Because I'm dealing with how other people see me. That's public regard. And that's going to play a part in how I appraise the situation or construct the situation. As you see, it says appraisal or construe. Construe is mentally constructing a situation. Because sometimes we see situations as they are, sometimes we don't see them as how they are, based on preconceived notions and ideas in our head, we reconstruct situations to go along with the ideas that we already hold as being true in our own minds. And then comes the behavior, which is the outcome. Alright? Try to speed this up along. I know I have to go on with it, but next slide, please, Dr. Muhammad. Alright. The multidimensional inventory of black identity. This great instrument was converted or was derived from the multidimensional model of black or racial identity, right? Now, as I explained to y'all before, the MMRI, as it's called in short, has been used, and it comes from the multidimensional model, but it's been used in a lot of situations to do research to gain knowledge on how racial identity impacts African Americans in regard to their academic performance, in regards to their academic beliefs, in regards to family life, in regards to drugs and substance abuse, and many other behaviors that people tend to engage in. We like to try to find out how racial identity plays a part. Okay, relationship between racial identity and academics, right? I'm going to explain a lot about this study because the study that I chose to outline here was a study where Tabby Shamus and colleagues took 606 black males. They took 606 black males, well not black males, black youth. And what they did was at the time that they were in 9th grade, they took them and they measured their racial identity using 3 of the 4. They didn't use the racial ideology, but they did use racial centrality, and they used public and private regard to measure the racial identity of African Americans who were in the 9th grade at the time, and then reconvened with them a second time when they hit the 12th grade. Some of them were in this school. As a matter of fact, out of the 606, 63 of them had dropped out of school. Out of the 63 that had dropped out of school, 28 were employed. The other persons were not employed at the time. Also, it was found that those with a higher level of racial centrality performed better and even went on to post-high school studies. In other words, they went on to attend college. Now, those who were found to have, alright, there were 4 groups, right? Alright, there were 4 groups. When they did the research, they categorized the results to place people into 4 categories. You had the buffering or defensive category, which buffering or defensive says, hey, these people scored high in terms of racial centrality, scored high in terms of their private regard. In other words, they felt good about being black, but they felt that society did not view black people in a positive light. Then you had the second group, which was low connectedness or high affinity. Now with the second group, we found that they had a low racial centrality, they had a high private regard, and a low public regard. In other words, these people felt like being black was not a critical part of their identity. It didn't really mean much to them. Kind of like, these colorblind people, what they call them, walking around here today, be like they don't see race or race ain't important to them. That kind of rhetoric. But then we have idealized. Now the idealized group scored above average on all 3 subscales of the testing. In other words, high public regard. They felt that most people view black people as good people. They felt like most people in society view black people as good people. They felt good about being black and felt good about other black people, and they had a high level of racial centrality, which means that race had a lot to do with how they define themselves. And then you have the alienated group, which scored low on all 3 subsectors that were tested.